Thank you both for being here. We talk about Iran. I want to start with like some key assumptions to allow us to kind of analyze the region. So I don't think either one of you would disagree with this assessment. I think, in fact, in your written statements, you both alluded to this. The three things that kind of drive Iranian decision-making across their spectrum, from so-called moderates all the way to the clerical folks. Number one is sort of a hegemonic view of the region, and largely tied to, my understanding, is their view of Persian culture and how ancient it is in comparison to, for example, the Gulf kingdoms and the like, which they view as kind of newer, inferior cultures in their mind. They certainly have great pride, and by the way, that's not new to this regime. That was also part of the thinking of the Shah, who was secular, right? The second is they view themselves as protectors of Shia minorities throughout the region. So in addition to involving themselves in some of these conflicts, they view themselves as the protectors of these minority groups in different parts, or in some cases majority groups who are not in majority power in some places. And the third is this sort of anti-Western, anti-US view that Western interference in the region has imposed all these sorts of Western institutions, and that's how they view Israel, as a Western creation, but also the U.S. military presence. And you would, number one, do you both agree with that assessment? And number two, would you agree that those are widely held positions throughout the political spectrum in Iran? They may debate how to pursue this in engagement with the United States, but that, what I've just described, is widely held across the political spectrum in Iran?
Yeah, Senator, I'd agree. I think that when it comes to the protector of Shia, it's probably more complicated in the sense that, as I said, it's a cynical regime that doesn't hesitate to support Sunni jihadist groups which are quite anti-Shia. And also the supreme leader of Iran likes to style himself as leader of all Muslims. But I think that it's roughly true what you said.
Yeah, and by the way, working with Sunni groups in the region for geopolitical purposes or as leverage on the United States or what have you is true. But if there is a Shia group somewhere in some country, Iran is always viewed, at least the supreme leader, as the protector of that group, or at least as an obligation to move in. Here's why I ask you that. Embedded in all of this is this conversation about what Iran's going to look like 20 years from now. So we've had successive presidents now reach out with the hopes of somehow strengthening the hands of what we term moderates at the expense of the clerics, who by and large, my understanding of the power of the supreme leader is basically the same as a monarchy. In essence, almost entire power that delegates down to some of the elected branches some day-to-day control. But in the end, the supreme leader is the ultimate authority on how much space they have, and that includes in the upcoming elections. So I guess my point is, as you look now towards the future, knowing what you both know about Iran, what hope is there of whether it's a change in a new supreme leader, which I think many people anticipate will happen here fairly soon for one reason or another, and or through elections, what hope is there of a leadership in Iran, based on what we know about these assumptions, that moves them a little bit more in a direction that will indeed allow them to perhaps reconsider some of the decisions they're making in the region? Or are we really looking at an intractable situation in the foreseeable future that no matter who comes to power, both as a next supreme leader and or president, we may call them moderates because of their approach on some of these issues, maybe a little bit less conflictive, but by and large, you are dealing with people that believe that Iran has a right to be the predominant power in the region because of their history as a Persian culture, who views their obligation to have to engage in the protection of Shia, and who continue to hold this view that the sort of Western presence in the region has undermined the region and in many ways redefined it. In essence, what hope is there of a transition to something a little different for the foreseeable future?
Well, we've been hoping for that transition for the last 40 years. What we've seen is that on occasion, a more moderate leader will be elected as president. We had it in the case of Khatami, yes, Khatami, sorry. President Khatami, we had it in the case of President Rouhani compared to his predecessor. But what we don't see is change in the fundamental attitude of the supreme leader, who I agree with you has real overriding control, and the institutions which he commands and is able to use, whether it's the Basij or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or the MOAS, to advance these various ambitions that are both hegemonic and revolutionary. And so, therefore, the big question is, what will the next Supreme Leader be like, and whether, after perhaps 5 decades, we'll see some thawing of that, the inspirations that are fueling these problematic behaviours. And that's an unknowable situation. I think that we need to continue to test the proposition by holding out the potential for Iran to take up its place as a regional power, but one that does not threaten its neighbours or seek to destabilise them, and does not seek to export its revolution to Shia minorities that creates instability in these neighbouring countries. And if they are willing to engage in a constructive way, we should be willing to respond. We need to hold that out for them, but we also need to avoid hoping that somehow it's going to happen. We'll know it when we see it.
I would agree with that. I would say that those we consider hardliners and those we consider moderates in Iran, like President Rouhani, they're all committed to the survival of the regime. And anti-Americanism is a pillar, ideological pillar of the regime. And so you may have moderates like Rouhani and Zarif who are more pragmatic when it comes to engagement with the West, especially economic engagement. But I think there's only so far they're willing to go. And of course, even when they go that far, they're accused of being anti-revolutionary, as we've seen in the last few weeks, by the more hardline forces. I don't think that reflects the people of Iran. And I think the people of Iran are not necessarily wedded to those ideas, and I'd like to see us engage more with them. And I think that even in a, say, post-regime situation, it's easy to envision that you could have, say, military elements and so forth who still see the United States as an obstacle to, say, hegemony for Iran in the region and aren't eager to work with us or really to have any dealings with us or see us as an enemy.
Just 2 quick points that encourage you both as you work on your scholarship and as you talk to others. I think the 2 immediate flashpoints we're going to see, and I think you would both agree, are upon ISIS's defeat in Iraq is what those Shia militias do vis-a-vis the United States, and whether they begin to immediately turn and attack us. Because I think Iran should be held responsible if they do. And you talked about Hezbollah. I just returned from the region. There's a widespread expectation that war between Israel and Hezbollah is inevitable. And I would say there are elements in the Lebanese government that are not pro-Hezbollah. The prime minister is an example whose father was assassinated by Hezbollah. And the argument that they make, and I'm just reporting back what they say, is anything we can do to strengthen the Lebanese army and the Lebanese armed forces undermines Hezbollah's ability in the country. That's a broader topic. Here's the one I wanted to ask you both about, and it's related to Iran, but it's a little broader. In Bahrain, where you have a 70% Shia population, but a Sunni governing class, I really felt, and perhaps I was wrong, but I really felt a few years ago there was an opportunity because at the time the Shia, many of the Shia groups in Bahrain were not asking for the overthrow of the king or the elimination of the monarchy. They were just asking for more political representation. And I really believed that had a space been created at that moment, that provided a unique opportunity. And perhaps I was wrong about that. That did not happen. And I think that actually opened the door for more Iranian influence because since all the other doors were closed, that was the other avenue that was there. As far as U.S. policy in the region, when things like that emerge in the future, my argument to Bahrain was they're an important ally, but what the situation they face is unsustainable in the long term. And the better thing to do is to create an internal accommodation over time that allows the Shia to be more represented in government and therefore less susceptible to Iranian argument. I think that's a part of our strategy towards Iran in the region as well, is not to allow these aggrieved parties to have no other option but Iran. And I don't know if either one of you have done any extensive amount of work on the Bahraini question in terms of the broader policy with regards to Iran.
Senator, I would agree with that. I think that it's good, friendly advice to our allies that they look to sort of embrace their own populations, that they look to be accountable to their populations as a way to defend against Iranian inroads. And this is the same advice. I know you're interested in Russia and Eastern Europe, Senator. The same advice we give Eastern European governments is make sure you're including those Russian minorities in your country, embracing them, treating them as full citizens, so that they don't become a potential vector for Russian influence in the country. Make sure you're addressing issues like corruption and so forth, which are often, again, an open door for Russian influence and Russian leverage over the political process. And I think this is something that all of our allies, especially in the Gulf, need to pay attention to, that part of defending against Iran is ensuring that your own political and economic institutions are inclusive and resilient and accountable. On the question of Hezbollah and proxies, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we need to look not just at the existing proxies, but where new ones may emerge, because this is clearly part of Iran's broader strategy. So you look at the Houthis, maybe they're not exactly a proxy now, but will they be in the future? Might there be new proxies in Syria? And I do think we have tools to push back on them. In Lebanon, we do have a government to work with and allies that we can work with who I think, frankly, we've ignored for the past 8 years. We do have a UN Security Council resolution, 1701, that I worked on that I think has also been largely ignored. We have a Shia community in Lebanon, which isn't, I think, well represented by Hezbollah, but is often terrorized by Hezbollah because they like Shia as long as you listen to them. But if you don't, you're in trouble. And then, of course, we have the ability to publicize the fact that Hezbollah and these other Shia proxies, they're not resisting Israel, they're not resisting the United States. They're killing Muslims, they're killing Arabs. That's what they're actually doing on the ground. And I think we can be absolutely clear about that.
If I might, I think you're absolutely right about Bahrain. But I imagine that after they listened to you, they turned around and said, "Oh, that's just another naive American advancing, democratic ideas. What we really, we know better." I think that there's a kind of attitude in the region that has become quite scornful of the notion of what's referred to as democracy or a freedom agenda or so on. And I think there's been a real setback in that regard, and it's difficult to make the case, and it's especially difficult to make the case when you've got the Iranians out there looking to exploit these Shia populations, because then you've got a bad guy that you can always point to excuse your own actions or lack of actions. So I think in the current circumstances, it's a very hard argument to make. I think Bahrain would have been far better off if they followed your advice, but they've consistently kind of gone the other way. And then there's, of course, the influence of Big Brother next door, Saudi Arabia, which, because it too sees the Iranians as an encircling threat, and they, to give them their credit, and I think the Deputy Crown Prince deserves a lot of credit for this Vision 2030 effort to transform Saudi society, even while all this is going on, is something we need to get behind. But I think we just need to recognize that in the current environment, our ability to actually change their minds on these things, it's going to be very difficult to do.
Yeah,
it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Sure, and just to be clear, I mean, I'm not naive enough to believe that Bahrain is going to look like New Zealand anytime in the near future in terms of their politics internally. I am saying that, for example, if you look at the Jordanians, who have slowly but surely begun to make steps in the right direction, and it's a balance. If you move too quickly, it could unravel. If you move too slowly, it could unravel. But I do think if you don't give 70% of your population the belief that they have a role to play in your politics, and the reforms that were being asked for 3 or 4 years ago were not outrageous. They were, if you don't accommodate for that, that pressure builds and it provides the opportunity for Iran to take advantage of it. And that was my argument at the time. So.